Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Let's start with the US presidential election, and wow, I got that one wrong, as did a number of opinion polls, and a few of those must now be struggling for a bit of credibility. It was a huge win for Donald Trump and the Republicans, bigger than in 2016 by far. All of this has been covered online already with a huge amount of analysis done by people far better qualified than I am, so I'm not going to do an across-the-board thing. I'll just make a couple of specific points. Mainly what I want to say is it looks like the level of anger, dissatisfaction and frustration with the government on the part of the majority of US voters is far stronger than what I previously believed. Despite the economic hardship being felt by so many Americans, I'm mildly surprised that people are okay with the concept of rounding up millions of migrants, legal or otherwise, and deporting the lot of them. Or they are okay with a huge increase in tariffs, mistakenly believing that the money coming from them will allow, as Donald Trump seems to believe, that they will raise so much money that all government programs, such as childcare, will be fully funded. Now, this is a particular irritant for me, but give me 1 minute to explain tariffs, because huge sections of the US media are incapable of doing that, and Australia isn't much better. Now, let's say I'm in the business of importing cars. I've got a $100,000 car coming into the country. The president slaps a 20% tariff on it. Now, when the car is unloaded from the ship and has to clear customs, the company importing the car, that's me, a US company, has to pay $20,000 to the customs officer. That's 20% of the $100,000. So you write out your check. But with that $100,000 car, I was anticipating a $10,000 profit before the tariff. So now all of a sudden that company is $10K in the red, $100,000 minus the 20 that I've just had to pay. So what does that company do? Well, they add $20,000 onto the selling price of the car to cover the cost of the tariff, so that the car now retails for $120K. Okay, the government has just pocketed $20,000 through customs, but the car is now so much more expensive that people no longer want to buy them, or they just buy a much smaller number. Now, because sales have plummeted, the government no longer receives significant revenue from tariffs, and certainly nowhere near enough to cover childcare programs or anything much else for that matter. Now, tariffs are good for protecting local companies that are struggling with international competition, but they're terrible for raising revenue for governments. It just doesn't work like that. Well, as another issue in this campaign, it turns out that many Republicans are getting information from alternatives to mainstream media, podcasts, because the mainstream media is no longer able to provide information of sufficient quality and sometimes quantity to explain what's really going on. It explains, dare I say, the popularity of podcasts such as this one. Now, presidential win, implications for AUKUS and the defence relationship. Well, the truth is we don't know. And it is wrong for Australian politicians to pretend it's business as usual. You know, it might be, but it probably will not. Now, I've always been concerned that rather than cancel the sale to Australia of second-hand nuclear-powered submarines outright, Donald Trump is much more likely to think, Australia is so desperate for these things, let's double the price. What will we do if rather than the current $4.6 billion being transferred to US submarine building companies, which as regular listeners know I think is completely wrong, but what happens if this subsidy is increased to $10 billion or $20 billion? And please don't tell me it couldn't happen. For the next decade, the Royal Australian Navy will spend more on acquisition than Army, RAF and Cyber combined. That's just a financial fact. But what do we do if, as a result of the presidential election, the RAN now requires 80% of the procurement budgets and many more acquisitions are cut? What if it goes up to 100% of our defence budget and we can no longer afford to fly our aircraft and put diesel in our tanks? At what point will a government say, enough, we just can't keep doing this? My big question is anyone in the current Australian government thinking about it, or in the Department of Defence? I very much doubt it, because it's a problem for next year or next decade rather than right now. This current government will just continue to kick the can down the road. I'm going to come back to this because I'll have a few words to say in a moment about the Submarine Institute of Australia conference, which was held here in Canberra last week. And a final comment about Donald Trump. I'm seriously worried about the future of Ukraine and the possibility that the United States will reduce or entirely cut off military aid. If Russia is allowed to win, that's a very ominous development, not only for Europe, but even for Australia, because the consequences will flow through to our region, and I'll elaborate on that in a future podcast. Another big event which occurred last week was the shortlisting of the Megami FFM from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and the MECO 200 from ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems for C3000, the general purpose frigate project. As listeners know, I thought a stronger competition might be between Germany and South Korea, but the reasons for that are quite detailed and I don't have a lot of time in this podcast. I'll just say that both Korean companies, Hyundai Heavy Industries and Hanwha Ocean, really wanted the deal and were extremely eager to understand the project requirements. To date, that hasn't been the case with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, who have been largely invisible in Australia, with their bid being submitted by the Japanese Defence Procurement Agency, known by the letters ATLA. That again might have been caused in part by the terrifying, unnecessary and indeed counterproductive secrecy requirements around this project established by Defence that have stifled any meaningful public discussion about what is happening. Now, hopefully, we will all hear a bit more from MHI during the next phase of the competition, some sort of offer definition activity, which will probably last 6 to 12 months. That's Japan. Now, to paraphrase a regular celebrity introduction, TKMS really doesn't need to be introduced, but they're a German company, German shipbuilding company. They built more than 80 MECO-class frigates for a dozen countries. Now, many of these have been built locally, such as the 10 Anzac-class frigates in the 1990s for Australia and New Zealand. TKMS can be considered a very safe pair of hands. The company is familiar with Australia and local technologies such as the Saab 9LV combat management system and CEA radars. We will do our best to continue to report on the total mess that this project is, despite the government's draconian sanctions on bidders, that we can be jailed or that they can be jailed for speaking with a few journalists. Perhaps that's where Donald Trump's idea of jailing journalists comes from. Now, next, the Submarine Institute of Australia conference. And before getting into some of the details, a few days ago, the company making up half of the Virginia-class submarines, Huntington Ingalls Industries, remember in the US they have a lead yard, follow yard arrangement with Electric Boat. HII also came out and confirmed publicly that the construction of the Virginias is having to slow down because of supply chain issues. So in the last few days, it has become apparent that these problems are real and they are very significant. However, you would not get that impression at the SIA conference, with everything apparently being sunlight and progress. Now, as a little aside, as a journalist, I received instructions there that are unprecedented. I've been to a lot of conferences in many different countries, and I was threatened that my media pass would be yanked and I would be kicked out if I approached anyone without permission. We're talking morning tea time. And I thought, this is Australia. This isn't feudal Japan, where you can have your head cut off if you make eye contact with a samurai. I'll speak with anyone I want to. And this is just, again, a further illustration of the totally ridiculous level of paranoia that is now just saturating the defence environment. This idea that I have to ask one of the conference organisers to ask another person at morning tea if I can go and say hello to them. It's absurd. Now, the main speech was from Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, who obviously brought along the wrong document. Someone in his office obviously printed the 2023 version of his speech, and he didn't check before reading it because it was almost exactly word for word from the one he gave last year. It started with an attack on the media, and he brought up the topic of the damage done to the Collins program in the mid-1990s by a huge headline story called Dud Subs, which I've touched on before, about a year ago, I think, in fact, after a previous SIA conference. He was very critical of the journalist. He name-checked Ian McPhedran, who wrote that story, and it did do an enormous amount of reputational damage to the program. But get this. The information that the journalist was using came from the Royal Australian Navy. It was passed on to him by a disgruntled surface ship operator who was jealous of the amount of positive coverage the Collins program was receiving, and so this person decided to wreck it and succeeded, probably beyond their wildest expectations. So, pal, don't you be blaming the media. Don't you be blaming individual journalists. How about you have a look at people in your own ranks who cannot keep information to themselves? And I'll repeat my offer of a year ago. Vice Admiral Hammond or his staff would like to contact me, I'll tell them who it is. Rather than threatening to yank my media pass at a conference, how about you all show some collective spine and yank this traitor's pension? Now, had to get that off my chest. Now, another, frankly, embarrassing answer given. And look, I won't name this fellow. He seems well-meaning. Very senior Royal Australian Navy submariner. Journalists asked him 3 times about the fire in Barrow. He mentioned that I mentioned it last week, where the British build their nuclear-powered submarines. 3 times he was asked for the consequences of the fire, and 3 times he said words to the effect, well, all of us are seeking to learn from this experience, and we're in consultations with our partners. And, I mean, you could almost hear the groan each time he came out with this nonsense. It's a fire. It's not some sort of joint learning experience, but this is how weird people are getting around AUKUS, that it's somehow obviously been drilled into them, or they think that they can't answer a direct question, that they've got to come up with meaningless waffle. Just answer the effing question rather than make a goose of yourself. Just say, I don't know. It's too early to tell. It's something that we're evaluating, not this nonsense of some sort of joint learning experience. Oh, and by the way, a UK Commissioner, High Commissioner Vicky Treadle, who I know quite well, she's a very nice person. I'm paraphrasing only slightly. Her take about the fire is AUKUS is too important for a mere fire to derail, which of course makes no sense at all. A fire is a fire and its consequences are real, and no amount of wishful thinking is going to change that. Now, on that theme, bear with me, King Canute was King of England from the year 1016 onwards, and being a Viking, he added Denmark a couple of years later, and 10 years after that, Norway. We're all familiar with a story illustrating his modest manner, demonstrating to various toadies and flunkies that he did not have the power to hold back the tide. He sat there said, I ordered the tide to stop coming in, and it didn't, demonstrating to people that he didn't have superhuman powers. Now, fast forward to today, and various AUKUS toadies and flunkies are insisting that they can increase the rate of construction of nuclear-powered submarines. And because of the huge amount of enthusiasm and bipartisan support in the US, the build rate of Virginia-class submarines can be raised from the current 1.4 per year to 2.33 per year, necessary for a sale to Australia. Let me explain as simply as possible. It won't matter to the function of the supply chain if every morning every member of the US Congress holds hands and sings Advance Australia Fair. Yes, more money is being thrown at the problem, but fixing the supply chain issues is much, much more complicated than that. It also won't matter how many times Richard Marles and Pat Conroy are entertained on arrival in Washington by the Marine Corps band. It won't make a scrap of difference. Now, I just have to conclude this rather dismal podcast, another pet theme of mine, Black Hawk helicopters and more deceit from Army. That's a strong word. So let me say what happened. This is on the subject of Black Hawks and weather radars and the fact that they don't have them. I've reported this makes them far less capable than Taipans. A couple of weeks ago, Major General Jeremy King was asked about this in Sydney at a Black Hawk function. He said, it will come with weather radar and FLIR and various other things. It'll come with a weather radar and a FLIR. I was immediately concerned because I never want to get my facts wrong. So on the 30th of October, I wrote to the Department of Defence, as I'm obliged to do. I'll read it out. Dear people of Defence Media, I have been informed that some of my reporting of the UH-60M helicopter is incorrect. I have been writing that the UH-60M does not have a weather radar, so can I clarify? Do Australia's UH-60Ms have a weather radar? Are all of the helicopters so equipped, or just some of them? Where is the weather radar display located? Who makes the weather radar? I would like to clarify this as soon as possible so I can correct earlier mistakes. Could I please have a response by close of business tomorrow, Friday, November the 1st? No reply. Well, guess why? I've checked with US sources, and the answer is Australia's Black Hawks will be capable of being fitted with a weather radar, but they do not have one now, and no one seems to know when or even if they will be fitted. So once again, this is the world that we live in, where people from Army Aviation are only telling part of the story and only the part of the story that suits them and their narrow objective. This just can't be allowed to continue. All of this incorrect information being pushed out into the public domain is just not in the public interest at all. And on a related topic, still no interview with Chief of the Army Simon Stewart. People are aware I requested that some time ago. Follow-up emails he's agreed to it. Follow-up emails to the Department of Defence have not received a reply at all. Welcome to the continuing world of journalism, where all information is being stifled and suppressed. And in the case of Black Hawks and Taipans, I think it's being done just to protect the reputation of a few senior figures in the Army and a few politicians as well. Okay, well, hopefully next time we might have something a bit more positive to talk about. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.